Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for others to join. I'm just going to wait for a few minutes before we start. Thank you for your patience. We're just waiting for a minute more, and then we're going to get started. I think we'll get started now. So good evening and assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be presenting an amazing seminar with Dr. Sadaf Jaffer. Our seminar is entitled Secularism, Sexuality in Islam, Ismat Chughtai Indian Muslim Progressivism. And we are going to go through the process with you for asking questions and so on. So before we get started, I would like to call on Zainab Jamal, please, to do the opening surah and the land acknowledgement. Zainab?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. I begin by acknowledging that Allah created humanity in and of this earth as her Khalifa, and this land that we're on has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We can never work to end systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of indigenous folks in our collective decision-making for social justice and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from the colonization and genocide of the indigenous people of this land. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Zainab. I'm going to ask Sabrina now to go over just a few housekeeping rules and then pass it on to Nina. Sabrina?
Definitely. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So before we begin the seminar, let's go through some housekeeping rules. So the first rule is that we ask that everyone please remain respectful. We also invite your comments and your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the seminar using the chat box. So questions will be addressed once the facilitator has completed her presentation. So please contribute to the Q&A session with an open mind and an open heart. Please use I statements when speaking. Please consider the Q&A session more of a dialogue instead of a debate, and choose to actively listen. And we'll also be sending you a post-event survey that will be sent to you by email or through the chat box, and it will take about 5 minutes to complete. And if you experience any kind of technical difficulties, please let us know through the chat box. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our second session of CCMW's Women Scholar Series. For the past 39 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, and to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are based on different topics related to Muslim women. We're looking forward to presenting these seminars over the next 10 months or so, inshallah. I'll now pass the mic back to Ismat Chughtai, CCMW's Executive Director. Thank you, Ismat.
Sorry, yes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Sadaf Jaffer. We're really pleased to have her with us this evening. Dr. Sadaf Jaffer is a scholar and activist. She recently completed 2 terms as mayor of Montgomery Township in New Jersey. In January of 2019, she became the first South Asian woman to serve as mayor of a municipality in New Jersey and the first Muslim woman to serve as mayor of a municipality in the United States. Her signature initiatives included creating and implementing a robust crisis communications plan to help Montgomery Township maintain some of the lowest COVID-19 infection and fatality rates in New Jersey, facilitating a participatory design and construction process for the township's new municipal center and library, while securing $5.375 million in state funding responding to demands for racial justice by coordinating meetings for Black community members and youth activists with the township's police leadership to build trust and mutual understanding, and inaugurating a youth leadership council to elevate the voices of young people who are energized to lead. Dr. Jaffer is a postdoctoral research associate in South Asian Studies at Princeton University, where she teaches courses in South Asian, Islamic, and Asian American studies. Her current book project, entitled Secularism and Sexuality in Indian Muslim Thought, Ismat Chughtai Literary Progressivism, examines Urdu writer and Indian cultural critic Ismat Chughtai's formation of what Jaffer terms as Indo-Muslim Muslim secular through Urdu literature and Bombay cinema from the 1940s through the 1980s. Sadaf argues that Chugtai formulated a discourse of secularism rooted in the Indian Muslim context. Her project also contributes to scholarship on Islamic societies by focusing on literary culture as a primary lens to approach Islam. Her writing has been published by the Journal of Women's History, as well as the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Huffington Post, Alt Muslima, and American Kahani. She was recently elected to serve on the Board of Trustees for the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Sadaf also serves on the Board of Directors for the New Agenda, an organization that promotes women's economic empowerment and combats sexual harassment and sexual assault. She was one of the founding members of Inspiring South Asian American Women, a group dedicated to encouraging civic engagement among South Asian American women in New Jersey. Sadaf earned her bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and obtained her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University, with a secondary field in studies of women, gender, and sexuality. So over to you, Sadaf, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. All right. So thank you again for inviting me, Sadaf Jaffer, and I'm here with you from New Jersey. I want to thank especially Ismat Chughtai for coordinating with me over the past several months. Before I get started with my talk as it specifically relates to the work of Ismat Chughtai, I want to begin by discussing my scholarly trajectory and how I, as a Muslim woman, arrived at the topics I'm investigating in my current research project. And I want to, congratulate you and thank you for working and focusing on the work of Muslim women scholars. When I enrolled in my undergraduate degree, I thought I wanted to pursue a career in diplomacy. After taking courses on the Muslim world, I was so surprised and fascinated by the materials I encountered in my courses on the literatures, law, history, and politics of Muslim societies that I decided to pursue academic research on Islam for myself. I remember the impact of learning about powerful Sufi women like Rabia of Basra, reading Ottoman court petitions of wives making demands for marital rights, and exploring Islamic philosophy that built upon Neoplatonism. Learning about Islam through a diversity of voices and sources is something that I myself try to provide for my students and readers of my research. One major goal of my work is to question ideas about center, periphery, and authority in Islamic studies. My interests often take me far afield from my undergraduate program's focus on the study of Arabic-speaking regions of the Middle East and North Africa. After college, I studied Urdu for 2 years at the American Institute of Indian Studies in Lucknow, India, and then completed a doctorate in Indo-Muslim culture. An author I had been exposed to for the first time during my Urdu study in Lucknow kept piquing my interest. I honestly couldn't shake the surprise I felt as a student of Urdu reading Chugtai's 1942 short story, Lihaf, where she explores the relationship between two women, as well as an uneven and inequitable sexual and financial dynamics in an Indian household. I realized that there was an entire heritage of Muslim South Asian literature that I was not aware of, and thus far had not figured in conversations about Islamic studies to which I'd been immersed. I'd also like to share some thoughts on the significance of South Asia within Islamic studies. As a region, South Asia, consisting of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives, has the largest share of Muslims in the world, accounting for more than 30% of the global Muslim population. Within the United States as well, more than 30% of American Muslims are of South Asian origin. Yet in both scholarly and popular understandings, it is not this region that first comes to mind when we think about Islam, nor is it the similarly populous regions of Southeast Asia or Western and Sub-Saharan Africa. At a basic empirical level, the distribution of Muslim populations in these regions ought to give us pause as we consider what constitutes the core and the periphery of the Muslim world. A major concern that guides my work is how to understand the history and trajectory of Muslim thought. Due to the prominence of political Islam in contemporary discourses, we are in danger of projecting the logics of political Islam back into Islamic history in an anachronistic way, one that takes colonial logics at face value. My work complicates the relationship between secularism and Islam by shifting the focus away from the typically male political figures, jurists, and theologians who are the subjects of so much scholarship and research. Instead, I engage with artistic and activist discourses in order to create a more capacious archive of Islamic history and civilization. My current book project centers on the Indian Muslim writer and cultural critic Ismat Chughtai, who lived from 1911 to 1991. Chugtai is perhaps best known for being tried for obscenity in 1946 over the publication of her short story Lihaf, or The Quilt, which explores a sexual relationship between two women. As a prolific author and public intellectual, Chugtai's writings provide insight into the everyday worlds of South Asian Muslim women, their experiences, practices, hopes, dreams, and desires. She was an avowed Marxist and a member of the Indian Progressive Writers Association. After the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, Chugtai remained devoted to articulating a place for Indian Muslims in India rather than in Pakistan, to which many of her colleagues had immigrated. She remains the most prominent woman novelist in the Urdu language, the language of North Indian and Pakistani Muslims, and yet she remains critically understudied. Chugtai was born in 1911 in the North Indian town of Badaun, where her father, Mirza Qasim Ali Beg, worked as a civil servant. She was the younger sister of noted Urdu writer Azim Beg Chugtai. She was among the first generation of Indian Muslim girls to attend modern schools. These schools were established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the efforts of community reformers. Many of these daughters of reform would later go on to shape ideas of modern Indian womanhood, as Chugtai has been credited with doing. In school, Chugtai studied subjects including English, Russian, and Urdu literature. She passed her matriculation examinations in 1932 from Aligarh Girls' School and went on to attend Isabella Thoburn College. IT College, as she and others fondly referred to it, was a prominent women's college attended by fellow literary luminaries, including Atiya Hussain and Gurtalain Haider. During Chugtai's final year at Aligarh Girls' School, authors Sajjad Zahir, Ahmed Ali, Rashid Jahan, and Mahmoud Zafar published the short fiction collection Angare, or Embers. The publication of Angare and its subsequent banning by the colonial administration is often seen as a catalyst for the formation of the Indian progressive writers movement. Angare, and in particular the work and influence of Rashid Jahan, had a great impact on Chugtai's development. She wrote one of her earliest articles in Aligarh University newspaper in support of Jahan. Chugtai maintained a lifelong affiliation with the Progressive Writers movement and attended the first Progressive Writers Conference in 1936, along with several others who were still students at the time, but who would become major literary figures in coming decades. Ali Sardar Jaffrey, John Nissan Akhtar, Khwaja Ahmed Abbas, and Shahid Latif, Chugtai's future husband. Chugtai was a prolific writer, publishing over 100 short stories, novels, and stories for films and radio plays. In 1938, at the age of 27, she submitted her first short story, Kafir, or Infidel, to the journal Saki, where it was published. Kafir told the story of the fraught relationship of a Muslim girl and her Hindu boyfriend. The two ultimately flaunt societal norms by eloping. Her fiction was sensational and proved to be popular almost immediately. With an established network through her brother, Azim, Chugtai became a regular contributor to Saki. In 1940, she was translated into English for the first time when her story, Genda, or Marigold, translated by Ahmed Ali, appeared in the London literary magazine Folios of New Writing, under the title The Little Mother. Published alongside new writing by contemporary authors such as Virginia Woolf and George Orwell, this translation made Chugtai's name known on the international stage. Maulana Salahuddin Ahmed published the first critical essay on her writing in 1941 in the Urdu literary magazine Adabi Dunya. In the same year, Chugtai moved to Bombay to work as an inspector of schools, and in 1942 married Shahid Latif, who was then a writer from Bombay Talkies, and with whom she set up a film production company called Filmina. As I noted, Chugtai is well known for the obscenity charges brought against her for the quilt. And this story had a number of contentious relationships, and the most famous among those is that between the mistress of a household and her female servant. Though acquitted of all charges in the 1946 trial, she retained the reputation as an obscene writer. Yet this reputation did not take away from the appreciation that Chugtai's artistic and intellectual contributions beyond Lihaf garnered within India and internationally. Among her many awards and accolades, she received the Padma Shri, a civilian award presented by the Government of India for her contribution to Indian literature and education, as well as the President's Award for Best Film Story for Garam Hava, or Scorching Winds, which was from 1973, which depicts the perils experienced by an Indian Muslim family in the immediate aftermath of partition. Throughout her life, Chugtai lived as a cosmopolitan public intellectual with global connections, attending the Helsinki meeting of the International Council of Women in 1954 and traveling to China and the USSR several times, including a final trip to Moscow in 1983 to receive the 1982 Soviet Land Nehru Award. Her relationship with Soviet and Russian writing and culture was a lifelong one. She died in 1991 in Bombay and was cremated, a practice that in India is strongly marked as Hindu. There were many who objected to this choice for a member of the Muslim community, while others saw it as consistent with Chugtai's iconoclastic persona. So now I'm going to shift from more of this biographical focus to Chugtai's writing as it engages with ideas of the secular. Quote, I am a Muslim. Worshipping idols is akin to polytheism. Yet the Hindu pantheon is my nation's inheritance. Encompassed within it are centuries of culture and philosophy. Faith is one thing, and the culture of one's homeland is another. I am entitled to an equal share of it, just as I am entitled to an equal share of its earth, sunshine, and water. With this passage from a 1970 essay for the magazine Aajkal, Ismat Chughtai delves into the complex, seemingly contradictory relationship between religious identity and national belonging. She lays claim to Muslim identity, making clear that she believes idols are at odds with one of the central tenets of Islam, namely the oneness of God. Yet drawing a distinction between faith and culture, she claims Hindu mythology as part of her national inheritance as an Indian. At its core, Chughtai's critique of society hinged upon the equality or barabari of all Indian people, whether they be women or men, Muslim or Hindu, master or servant. The primacy of humanity or insaniyat over other identities was the keystone of her formation of the secular, and has its roots in the long-standing critique of religious boundaries in a tradition that can be termed Islamic humanism. It was also rooted in a cosmopolitan understanding of human worth engendered by creative integration of ideas found in European realist literature. In her 1952 essay From Bombay to Bhopal, Ismat Chughtai recounts an episode that occurred as she was riding on a train with a group of fellow progressive writers en route to a conference. While they played rummy to pass the time, the train pulled past the shrine of the 13th century saint Haji Malang, whose shrine sits on a plateau beneath a steep cliff pictured in the slide here. Like much of the landscape of rural India, the hills around Mumbai are dotted with shrines which draw devotees from India's multitude of religious communities. With characteristic humor, Chugtai recounts her group's conversation about the fate of the shrine as a symbol for Indo-Muslim practice in the new climate of post-partition India. A colleague playfully asks, quote, do you think these venerable saints have conferences? If there were a conference, what would they talk about? What problems would they have? End quote. Chugtai jokes that they would probably complain that people weren't giving them enough offerings and that attendance was low after many of India's wealthy Muslims had moved to Pakistan. Her colleague replies, quote, so why don't these saints head off to Pakistan too? After all, they do fulfill the whole world's oaths and wishes, end quote. Chugtai forcefully asserts that there will be a continued place for Islam in India, retorting, quote, how can you say this? India is a secular state. Religious tolerance will persist here. Muslims will have a right to freely construct as many shrines to Haji Malang as they want to build, end quote. The use of the shrine as a symbol of secularism and toleration could potentially seem contradictory, and it's worth remarking on. In Chughtai's text, the lived practice of the diverse followers of shrines like Haji Malang Sharif stand in stark opposition to the rigid boundaries of the religious communalism that characterized partition. Though Haji Malang is a shrine to a Muslim saint, the hereditary right to conduct its festival belongs to a Brahmin Hindu family, and devotion to the saints transcends religious boundaries. A question arises here regarding the genealogy of Chughtai's ideas regarding secularism. Much contemporary scholarship posits a fundamental distinction between the secular and religion that is alien to the Islamic discursive tradition. I argue that instead of rejecting Muslim engagement with secularism with Islam outright, we should instead look to ways in which secularist discourse is accommodated within the Muslim tradition rather than outside of it. Throughout her writing, Chugtai repeatedly equates the secular with Islamic concepts of love for humanity, or insan dosti, and humanism, mazhab-e-insaniyat. The intellectual genealogy of this latter term mirrors its linguistic origin, borrowed from Arabic via Persian. Like Cicero's notion of humanitas for early Islamic philosophers, the ideal of insaniya, or humanity, was a process of acquiring virtue and perfection. To a certain degree, this process demanded a kind of openness to the world and intellectual cosmopolitanism. A millennium before Chugtai, an anonymous philosopher belonging to the so-called Brethren of Purity, or Ikhwan al-Safa, had written that the perfect human being is, quote, a Persian in origin, an Arab in religion, Abrahamic in Islam, an Iraqi in education, a Hebrew in astuteness, a Christian in conduct, a Damascene in piety, a Greek in the sciences, an Indian in expressiveness, a Sufi in subtleties, end quote. Ideas of religious tolerance and humanist ethics run through the history of Muslim and South Asian thought. Already in the early centuries of Islam, thinkers such as Ibn al-Muqaffa asserted ideas of ethical universality. Ibn al-Muqaffa's one of the most important figures in the translation of ancient Persian knowledge into the Islamic world, was an important figure in the intellectual landscape of early Islamic Baghdad. In the introduction to his translation of a collection of animal stories known as the Book of Khalila and Dibna, perhaps the most widely read and frequently adapted work of classical Arabic literature, he writes, quote, in no single religious group did I find that degree of honesty and right-mindedness which would induce rational persons to accept their word and be satisfied with them. I've decided to limit myself to those whose deeds all men recognize as good and which are in agreement with all religions, end quote. Here, Ibn Muqaffa questions the authority of any one form of religious thought over another, and instead only accepts that which is universally held to be true. Ideas of the universality of religious truth and its ability to transcend formal religious boundaries were picked up in early Sufi literature and remained a constant theme throughout Islamic history. These ideas from the early and medieval Islamic periods were also brought to South Asia. Here, the encounter between Muslim and Hindus prompted extended reflection on the nature of religious plurality. Amongst Sufis, the esoteric belief in unity and multiplicity, or wahdat al-wujud, the unity of being, provided an important basis to accommodating diversity. Throughout the subcontinent, antinomian strands of Sufism led poets to identify with idolatry and infidelity in their rejection of exoteric, or Zahir Islam, and their embrace of universal religion, as poets likened their desire for union with God to the love of an idolater for an idol. This, combined with ideas about the Islamic millennium in 1591 to 1592, led to a period of inquiry into the universality of religious truth. After a series of debates between different religious communities in the Mughal capital, the Emperor Akbar declared himself as a Sufi paragon of, quote, the perfect man, Insan al-Kamil, and initiated a new imperial religion, the divine religion, Din-e-Ilahi, at which the emperor sat at the center as supreme lawmaker. Following this principle, Akbar instituted a new religious system founded on an ethic of tolerance referred to as Solikul, universal harmony, in which the subjects of the empire would receive equal treatment regardless of religious affiliation. It is here in the early modern period that the Muslim and global histories of the secular converge. As Rajiv Kinra has argued, the ability of different castes of Indians to work together during the reign of the Emperor Jahangir so impressed Sir Thomas Roe, King James's envoy to the Mughal court, that he argued in British Parliament that the English should similarly be tolerant to ethnic and religious minorities. Through speeches such as Roe's, the tolerance of the Mughal realm became known to the English public of the early Enlightenment period. This is not to say that Islamic humanist thought catalyzed the development of European ethics of tolerance, but rather that the strands of secular thought did not develop in complete isolation from one another, and therefore cannot be considered as wholly alien to one another. Urdu language poets also employed literary tropes of infidelity and the religion of love, distancing themselves from rigid religious identities. One of the earliest poets to write in the Urdu language, Mir Taqi Mir, who lived from 1723 to 1810, wrote, quote, "Why are you asking Mir now about his religion? He has drawn a Brahmin's mark, sat in a temple, and abandoned Islam ages ago." Likewise, the last poet laureate of the Mughal Empire, Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib, the first line of whose divan provides the title for Chugtai's autobiography, invoked the legacy of the famous apostate Sinan, who had fallen in love with a Christian maiden, writing, quote, "I am an infidel of love, and hell does not suit me. I have been burned by jealousy for the heat of Sinan." Idolatry and infidelity had become a topos of the pre-modern Persian and Urdu poetic voice. As Ghalib said, quote, "I will not quit worshiping that infidel idol, nor will people quit calling me an infidel," end quote. The tradition of Indo-Persian humanism finds strong resonance throughout Ghalib's writing. With the exile of the last Mughal emperor to Rangoon in 1858, India's Muslims were left without a native ruler and instead came under the formal rule of the British government, the so-called British Raj. The drastic changes that transformed Indian society during this period gave rise to a variety of literary responses. Eventually, towards the end of the British Raj, the Indian progressive writers movement of the 1930s and 1940s focused on collective action oriented towards the cause of social and economic justice rather than civilizational restoration. And I shared with you earlier a little bit about, the progressive writers. So I want to now shift to a little bit of how the topic of sexuality is related to Ismat Chughtai work. Certainly the most controversial publication of Chugtai's career was Lihaf, or the Quilt. It was published in 1942 in the Lahore-based literary journal Adab-e-Latif under the supervision of the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz. In the same year, several other progressive writers, indeed some of the most prominent Urdu writers of the 20th century, had published short stories in the journal, including Khwaja Ahmed Abbas, Krishan Chandar, Rashid Jahan, Rajendra Singh Bedi, and Manto. The following year, the story was included in the second collection of Chugtai's short stories published in Delhi by Shahid Ahmed under the title Chote. Lihaf is narrated by a young girl who is sent by her mother to stay with family friends while her mother is traveling. While there, she comes to learn about the relationship between the mistress of the household, Begum Jan, and her servant and masseuse, Rabbo. Begum Jan is in a loveless marriage in which her husband, the Nawab Saab, shows more interest in the young male Quran students whom he hosts at his estate than in his wife. Begum Jan tries everything to attract his attention to no avail and sinks into loneliness and depression. Her well-being improves dramatically through an intimate relationship with her maid, Rubbo. The child narrator sleeps in the same room as Begum Jan and regularly witnesses commotion under the swaying quilt. The narrator herself has disturbing and charged encounters with Begum Jan, and at the end of the story sees something under the quilt that is not revealed to the reader. The story begins in the intimacy of the narrator's bed. She explains that the swaying elephantine shadows her winter quilt casts on the wall remind her of bygone days. At the end of the frame, the reader is transported to those earlier days. Chugtai utilized a variety of strategies to question gender norms in Lihaf. At the outset of the story, the narrator recalls her gender-bending youth, quote, "This is a tale from the days when I used to spend my time fighting with my brothers day and night. Sometimes I would ask myself why I was so aggressive. At the same age when my other sisters were gathering admirers, I was busy fighting with every boy or girl I met," end quote. She narrates that her non-compliance with gender norms through the practice of fighting, as compared to her sister's gathering of admirers, is significant because, quote, "This was the reason that when Amma was going to Agra, she left me with her close friend for the whole week." The reason her mother felt comfortable leaving her with this friend was because there were no children around and there would be no one with whom she could get into fights. It is while providing background on her mother's friend that the reader is introduced to Begum Jan, whose relationship with the housemaid Rubbo is the best known part of the story. A household with no children is markedly different from the normative Indian household at the time. Thus, this simple detail alerts the reader that there's something notable about Begum Jan's family life. Begum Jan was from a poor family, but her parents had married her to a Nawab, or a nobleman, despite his old age because he was thought to be pious. For example, no prostitutes or courtesans were seen at his manor, and he had performed the Hajj pilgrimage and sent his sisters on Hajj as well. Drawing on literary predecessors for whom outward piety was regarded as insincere, in Chughta's literary universe, this external religiosity is an immediate sign of a suspicious character. The uncanny nature of this household is repeatedly emphasized. The reader's suspicions regarding the Nawab are further stoked when the narrator states, quote, "He had an exceedingly strange hobby. Unlike other noblemen who raised pigeons or engaged in cockfighting, the Nawab's residence was home to students who were described in a sensual manner, quote, young, fair-skinned, narrow-waisted boys," end quote, whose expenses were paid for by the Nawab himself. This juxtaposition of the Nawab's seemingly pious lack of interest in women and his strange hobby of supporting young male students points towards the Nawab's pedophilic desires. The story, in spite of its reputation, is not a celebration of same-sex love. The Nawab's interest in young boys is sinister rather than laudatory. This strange space is where Chugtai integrates questions of economic disparity and unjust power dynamics with an exploration of human sexuality. It is not the homosexual undertones to the Nawab's interest in his young students. Rather, it's the financial power he wields over them and his wife that makes the situation disturbing. The short story form chosen by Chugtai to tell this, and indeed most of her stories, is also effective in conveying the fragmented take on the lives of her characters. Despite this, contemporary critics of the story ignore these accounts of sexual exploitation and instead focus solely on the relationship between Begum Jan and Rabbo. When the unfortunate Begum Jan married into the household, the narrator recounts that the Nawab placed her, quote, in the house and along with all the furniture and personal items, forgot about her, end quote. She suffered a great deal due to his disinterest in her existence, and it is assumed the neglect of her sexual needs. Rabbo, quote, saved her just as she was sinking lower and lower, end quote. The key to this saving, which brought the color and life back into Begum Jan's body, was massaged by Rabbo using a strange and queer oil. Again, the text emphasizes the uncanny nature of the substance that rejuvenates Begum Jan. Rabbo is constantly at Begum Jan's side, having no other work in the household but attending to Begum Jan's massage. At night, the narrator sees the quilt on Begum Jan's bed moving around like an elephant. When she cries out that she is scared, Begum Jan tells her to recite a verse from the Quran and go back to sleep. When that doesn't work, the narrator asks if there might be a thief in the room. To this, she hears Rabbo's voice reply, "What thief?" That Rabbo's voice emerges from under Begum Jan's quilt so shocks the narrator that she hides herself in her covers and goes back to sleep. Rather than the nighttime vision of a swaying quilt, the most troubling encounter of the story occurs when Rabbo is away. Wanting to help Begum Jan feel better during Rabbo's absence, the child narrator offers to scratch Begum Jan in her place. In this encounter, the reader witnesses a disparity in power and understanding between Begum Jan and the child narrator. Begum Jan keeps the narrator occupied in conversation and asks her what she wants from the market, suggesting a doll that opens and closes her eyes. Begum Jan also offers to get new clothes made for the child. Although she does not protest very vocally, the narrator grows terrified of Begum Jan after this encounter, avoiding her at all costs. The references to buying her items from the market highlight the economic power Begum Jan holds over all those in her daily life, and Begum Jan's use of the child for her sexual satisfaction without consent or understanding is the most powerful way the story exposes the potential for abuses of trust and power within the traditional household structure. The narrator insists on going home when, on another occasion, Begum Jan changes clothes in front of her. Once again, Begum Jan tries to ply her with promises of taking her to the bazaar and reminds her that her brothers would beat her when she returned home. Rabbo, who has now returned, dissuades Begum Jan from her pursuit of the narrator's company, saying, quote, "Raw mangoes are sour, Begum Jan," end quote. The story ends with the corner of the quilt being lifted and the narrator catching a glimpse of what was happening underneath, though she refuses to describe it in detail. Lehaf is often cast as shocking because of what is considered to be the homoerotic elements of the story. However, writing about sexuality has a long history in Islamic literature. There are a number of reasons why Chugtai was singled out for censure, whereas these older forms of expression of what can be read as alternative sexualities were not. One is that the writer identified as a woman. It was particularly offensive to social sensibilities for Chugtai to approach such topics. It was one thing for men to discuss sexuality, or in the case of the Rekhti form, even take on the perspective of a woman. And yet it was another thing entirely for a woman from a Sharif background to write about sexuality and alternative sexualities at that. Another element is that the form of Chugtai's writing attracted even more censure. The literary form of the short story, particularly the realist short story, does not have the same generic conceits as classical Urdu or Persian poetry, and the claim of realist authors to bring the private into the public can be seen as threatening the social order. Chugtai indicated in her writing and interviews that sexual and affective relationships between women were common occurrence in her social circles. She claimed that, quote, "When I wrote this story, I lived with my brother. I wrote the story at night. In the morning, I read it out to my brother's wife. She didn't say that it was a dirty story, but she recognized who it was about," end quote. In addition to this anecdote that provides context for her writing of Lihaf, there are numerous examples in her autobiography and her autobiographical essays of romantic relationships between women, most often schoolgirls. Chugtai posits a social milieu in which physical or sexual acts between women were commonplace. In other words, it was not as if she were advocating for obscene behaviors or actions. Rather, she was simply bringing a particular case to light in order to talk more broadly about sexual and economic injustice. This claim of innocence from the charge of obscenity is one that is carried throughout her responses regarding to the story Lihaf. Critics did try their best to censure her and censor her work. In 1942, she was charged with publishing obscenity. Anxieties surrounding the impending obscenity trial of Chugtai and Manto resulted in distress within the Progressive Writers Association. Already since the 1930s, the meeting of the Progressive Writers Association served not only to discuss aspects of progressivism, but to discipline members who were accused of reactionary or Rajat Pasand writing. The use of obscene language was a sensitive topic among progressive authors. By the time of Chugtai and Manto's obscenity trial, the question of whether obscenity had any place in progressive literature was a hotly debated issue. At the 1945 All India Progressive Writers Association conference in Hyderabad, Dr. Abdul Alim introduced a resolution against the use of obscene language. According to the resolution, quote, "The trend of obscenity, which is increasing, has nothing to do with the perspective of progressive movement and progressive literature. Progressive writers are opposed to obscenity and understand that it is unhealthy and harmful for literature to publish it," end quote. The resolution was, however, defeated. The author Qazi Abdul Ghaffar objected to the resolution, saying, quote, "Sex is also one of the most important questions in our society," end quote. All the same, the question of the relationship between sexual justice and progressive writing remained an open one within the Progressive Writers Association. In 1946, Chugtai and Manto were put on trial in Lahore for obscenity. The delay between the charges and the trial was at least in part due to the writer's attempts to have the charges dismissed, particularly on account of the hardship for Chugtai to travel to Lahore as a young mother. As explored above in Chugtai's Lihaf, the sexual practices of these women were never named outright, nor do they define an identity of the characters involved. Rather, her account of the trial, she claimed that she was simply relating stories she had heard in her social circles. By writing actively about the sexuality of women, Chugtai was characterized by her detractors as engaging in a reprehensible act. Reprehensible because a woman's sexual autonomy violates the closed structure of the home and women's confinement to the private sphere. While representations of sexuality, even female sexuality, had been acceptable within the Urdu tradition, sexual expression by someone identified as a woman, particularly one belonging to a respectable class, was unacceptable. In Chugtai's account, when the witness for the prosecution realized that his case was faltering, he directly approached her and told her that if she agreed to apologize, her legal fees would be paid for. She refused and was called to the judge's chamber. She recounted the judge as saying, quote, "I have often read your stories and they aren't obscene, nor is Lihaf obscene, but Manto's writings are full of filth," end quote. Though his pronouncement of judgment would have exonerated her from the charge of obscenity, she was not satisfied, allowing him the prerogative of censoring Manto's stories. In her recollection of her response, I read a justification for the idea that artists must represent the world in all of its complications, even if those aspects of the human experience that may seem improper. Chugtai retorted, quote, "The world is also littered with filth," end quote. The judge then asked Chugtai, "Is it necessary to throw it up in the air?" End quote. The character of the judge presents the view that perhaps artists should ignore the unpleasant, disturbing, and confusing aspects of the human experience for the sake of propriety and not serve as potentially corrupting influences on their audience. Chughtai's account of her response provides a powerful take on the stakes of literature and the arts. Quote, "Throwing it around makes it visible, and we can turn our attentions towards cleaning it up," end quote. In other words, even if certain members of the audience find the subject of extramarital or homoerotic sexual relationships to be distasteful or dirty, literature should address all of the realities of life, including the distasteful and dirty. By exposing the realities of the human experience to the reader, writers foster the moral education of the reader by exposing them to the breadth of possibilities in human life and relationships, and thus provide the opportunity to question the realities of society. If they wish to do so, readers may thus work towards progress towards a more equitable and just society. So just to kind of sum up overall what I've been discussing today, I use Chughtai's work as a focal point to understand a history of Islamic humanism as it relates to the relationship between different religious communities and secular thinkers within Muslim societies. And there's a particular role for explorations and discussions of sexuality as it relates to understanding how we can frame a just society. And today I was looking and discussing mostly the short story Lihaf, which is really Chughtai's most famous story, but she has so many other investigations of sexuality and power dynamics and economic injustice. They're all very much intertwined in her work. And I think that that's something that makes her unique in her approach to progressivism and progressive writing. But I think, more broadly, I argue that the progressive writers, including Chugtai, are really the inheritors of a long tradition, of a long literary tradition in Muslim societies. And it's not that they represent some sort of a break from the past. So that concludes my formal remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Sadaf, for that presentation. So we are going to begin the Q&A session. So if anybody has questions, it's a great time to ask. So our first question is by Nazhat. So the question reads, "Do you still believe that Islam can survive in today's India?" Great question.
Well, I mean, it's definitely surviving and thriving in a way. Muslims in India are facing a lot of challenges, but there's also huge protest movements taking place to defend the rights of Muslims in India. I think more than whether Islam can or will survive, because I think certainly it will. I think the question is, what's the future of secularism in India, or Indian secularism? And I think that that's something that really remains to be seen when you have a Hindu nationalist party with so much political power throughout the country. But there are always sites of resistance, and I think that exploring history often gives us new ways of thinking about the future that are not so divided amongst on religious lines, or saying that. And I think that I would say that my argument about secularism being just as much of an inheritance of Muslim societies in South Asia is also applicable to those who claim, well, we have to have a certain understanding of religion writ large, whether it's Islam or Hinduism, that it is kind of dominating and must permeate all elements of society, that's not really a necessity. And we have just as much of a reason to claim a historical link to humanism and really be a part of secular thought and secular approaches to politics in South Asia as any other region of the world.
Thank you so much. So our next question is by Saima. So the question reads, would Ismat Chughtai survive in today's India? Even Salman Rushdie recently said that the country he wrote about in Midnight's Children has ceased to exist.
Well, I think that, you know, there isn't one totalizing narrative that encompasses all of India. Different people in India have different experiences based on their circles, their economic power, their political power. But I do often wonder how she would feel, because she was so dedicated to Indian secularism, and she felt such a connection to her heritage as an Indian, and also to, you know, being a part of Islamic civilization and being very well versed in Urdu and Persian literature. So I don't know what her reaction would be. It certainly seems like we're definitely in a difficult phase right now, but I can only say that I find hope in the protest movements, and that I hope that younger generations are able to kind of overcome the really rigid narratives about religious belonging and even, you know, what Islam in South Asia was all about. I think that that's part of the narrative of the Hindu right, that Islam in South Asia was somehow very violent and troubling and foreign, and really, when we look at the historical record, that's not accurate. So I would hope that research like mine that brings to light an alternative and, you know, more accurate perspective on the past is helpful for those activists in trying to lay claim to a different type of Indian identity.
Thank you so much, Sadaf, for that. Our next question is by Charles. So Charles asks, how exactly are insania and secularism related?
Well, I would say that insania is related to the concept of humanism. And globally, the emergence of secularism had to do with a global exchange of ideas. And so, as I mentioned in my talk, it was actually Europeans who came to the Mughal court and saw how different religious communities were dealt with, that then took that back with them and said, oh, we should deal with each other in a similar way. So I think ultimately I'm arguing against this very strict delineation between East and West, that we can somehow say, well, this is Eastern thought, this is Western thought, they're completely separate, they have no interaction, which is just a very false dichotomy, because ideas were always flowing back and forth, just as goods were always flowing back and forth. And so, you know, just as Europeans can lay claim to a history of secularism through European humanist writers, I would say that similarly, South Asian and Muslim secular thought is also based in their own trajectory of humanist thinking, which I laid out a bit of in today's talk.
Thank you very much, Sadaf, for that. Our next question is by Wiza, and her question is, how do we bring more progressive narratives into mainstream Islam? There is such a rich tradition of progressivism in Islam that is largely hidden away.
Well, I think stories are a really good way to do it. And I think diversifying our courses on literature in school, offering more materials from South Asia and Muslim societies, from the literary traditions, because I feel as though the way that Islam is often portrayed and understood is purely through legalistic discourses, as if that encompasses all of the Islamic tradition. Whereas we know that, and this is an argument made by a scholar named Shahab Ahmed in his book, What is Islam?, that the moral education of most Muslims throughout history was actually through literature. And there are great works of literature that were extremely popular throughout Islamic history. I think that it's worth a lot of us reading them and trying to understand what their message was, and that I think that literature in general allows us to access a part of the human experience that is very unique, and allows us to kind of understand people from different contexts. And there are common themes, right, in literature across civilizations, oftentimes love, family relationships, difficulties. So I would say diversifying the canon of what we read in our coursework, and it's all there. It's just that we need to kind of dive into it and create easily accessible ways for people to find this material.
Thank you, Sadaf. I'm going to go to a question that I think was presented on the Facebook Live viewing. So the question reads, are you aware of how well-known Chugtai's story, Lihaf, and the obscenity charges are known by Pakistanis? Based on what you said about her stories, they don't differ in stories in a wide Muslim tradition? Would she still face the same charges in Pakistan?
Okay. Well, I think that, she has the reputation of being an obscene writer, I would say, even if people don't know the details of why that is. But I think, it's instructive to look at the experience of Manto, who was a really close friend and ally of Chaktai. So in 1946, they both had an obscenity trial in late colonial India, right before independence, and they were both acquitted. Chugtai stayed in India, and then she was never tried for obscenity again. Whereas Manto, who moved to Pakistan, was tried for obscenity multiple times by the Pakistani government. So I would say that there was less of an acceptance of discussing and writing about sexuality in Pakistan than there was in India. And I also think that it has something to do with being a minority community in India versus being the majority community in Pakistan. That in India, it was kind of just like, all right, well, whatever. She's writing about Muslims, and there isn't so much of a need to kind of police that. Whereas, when her story was interpreted in this film Fire, that had a sexual relationship between two women, but they were placed in a Hindu family, there was a lot of reaction to that. And, movie theaters in India had posters torn down and were smashed and things like that. So, there's a different history, different interest of the state in trying to police what they consider to be obscenity if you belong to the majority community or to the minority community. But I would say that sometimes it's shocking to me, and like I shared some of those couplets from Urdu poetry from Mir and from Ghalib. It's shocking to me the types of things that people used to write in Urdu. It was thinkable. It was something that people would share, and they saw some benefit of it in it. They saw that, sometimes you have to explore these other sides that seem contradictory or seem like they're going against religion, but that's just a part of the human experience. And I do wonder, and I do ask myself how acceptable people would find it to publish those sorts of things now. And I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but I would say that our understanding of what is thinkable within Muslim communities there are definitely forces and people who want us to keep narrowing it and narrowing it and narrowing it. And so I think finding these examples from the past is helpful to say, actually, like, we have a tradition of people being very, very iconoclastic and kind of saying all sorts of off the wall things or things that might seem offensive. And it was widely accepted in society. So, I can't provide definite answers, but those would be kind of my general perspective on that.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question by Charles, and I'm sorry if I'm going too fast at that.
No, that's fine.
Apologies. But so Charles asks, what are your views on other forms of secularism that directly target religion, such as the French, Nazha, you can probably pronounce this so much better than me, but laïcité. Say it, sorry.
Laïcité.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think that what I would advocate for is not policing people's practices. And on the one hand, allowing people, for example, to go to these syncretistic shrines in India where there's Muslims, Hindus, Christians going together, and not saying, no, this is just for Hindus or this is just for Muslims. You might have heard recently that Sai Baba, who's really revered by a lot of people in India, mostly Hindus, one of his, like icon of him was destroyed by some Hindu right-wing people, saying that this person was Muslim and all sorts of things. And that was quite shocking because he is quite a revered figure. And so on the one hand, that's a trying to police things and say that, no, you either are Hindu or you're Muslim and we can't have this anymore. So I'm definitely, that's not acceptable for me. But also, we're seeing all sorts of very disordered perspectives on secularism in France that specifically, obviously, are targeting the Muslim community. And it's not about, well, we don't want religion in the public sphere. That's really just an excuse to say we don't want visible Muslimness in the public sphere. So, I mean, that's obviously not compatible or fair with the Muslim community. And I think that it's very unreasonable to expect people to leave their religion behind and to not have any sort of identification with their spiritual practices. And especially because it's never applied equally across the board. It's usually specifically about minority religious traditions that people are not comfortable with.
Thank you, Sadaf. Another question. I know I should give you a breather, but
No.
Okay, so this question reads, can you please briefly talk about Ismet's private life and how that impacted her work?
Sure, absolutely. So she, in her autobiography, which is really fascinating, it's entitled Gagasi Berahan, and it's also published, translated in English, just as a life in words. She talks about, growing up, going to girls' school, seeing all of these women, young girls who form really close romantic type of relationships with each other. But then she married a writer, Shahid Latif, and they started a film company together. And later on in their marriage, he left her for another woman. And it's interesting because she wrote Lehaf when she was newlywed, a newlywed bride. She had a baby, and her in-laws were not very happy that she had published this story that was bringing so much attention to them. So, and she actually, it's interesting because some of the publications that she did right after she got married, she published them under the name Ismat Shahid Latif. But eventually she went back to publishing as Ismat Chughtai. And though they were both writers and then they got married, her star kind of went up, and her husband is not nearly as well known as she is. And even during her lifetime, that was the case. So I think that there were a lot of dynamics there in terms of the success of her career versus his not really having that much prominence. Her having the tensions of trying to be like the proper daughter-in-law or fit into her in-laws and her extended family, but then also the challenges to that based on what she wanted to do with her own life. So it's definitely a complicated life. And she had 2 daughters. I do feel like sometimes there's this, it is interesting to look at someone's personal life and how it plays out or connects to their politics. But she always wrote about how important it was for women to have economic independence and just have autonomy and consent in all of their relationships.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. Another question reads, how do we strike the balance between speaking openly about these very important issues related to sexual freedom in Islam, while at the same time ensuring that we do not feed into right-wing narratives of the religion? In terms of like the oppression that people might face,
I'm guessing that's what's behind that question. I hear what you're saying. I think that there is an issue of audience, and there is a responsibility to think about what we're publishing in the political context that we're in, and does it reinforce stereotypes about our communities? And I think that some authors, do write things that really make you feel like, in a context where people are not being exposed to so many different Muslim stories, it does behoove us to think about how we present our characters, especially, I would say, how do we write about Muslim men? So, I'm definitely one of those people who does think that writers and intellectuals ought to think about the political implications of what they're saying. But then on the other hand, the more accurate information that we publish and the more diversity of stories that we publish or that we talk about, it just gives more depth and richness to our own understanding of Islamic history, but also that of the broader public, because there's a whole industry that's just pumping out misinformation purposefully about Islam and Muslims and Muslim history. And so I feel like the only antidote to wrong information is to put out as much correct information and diverse perspective and diverse experiences from Muslim communities as we can.
Thank you, Sadaf. How is it that Ismat's work is getting so much attention now than it did 50 to 60 years ago? Who are the other women progressive writers at the present time?
Yeah, I think that it is very interesting. I mean, Chugtai's work was part of school curriculums in India. So she was always kind of present there. But I would say that there was like a renewed interest in her work in like the early 2000s, when a lot of her work started being published in English. So first of all, it started being accessible to a public that didn't read Urdu or potentially didn't even read Hindi, because her work is often transliterated into Hindi as well. So that brought it to a whole new audience. And then I would say to some degree, it also had to do with the gay rights movement in India, and people looking for stories that they could say, look, we've had writers who've talked about same-sex desire and same-sex relationships before. So, I write about this in my book, that the engagement of that movement with Ismat Chughtai work is rather shallow, because, as I said, it's the story Lihaf, at least, is not at all a celebration of same-sex desire. And sometimes that's how it's described in the popular press. It's more about power dynamics and how people abuse power. There are other instances, where she talks about two girls playing bridegroom and things like that are more, I would say, have a more of a positive perspective, or as I said, from her autobiography, where she talks about girls in her school. But I think that, that attention from the gay rights movement brought some more attention to her work. And then I also think that there was an interest in, I would say that there's an interest in a broad spectrum of Indian society in Urdu literature as kind of a way to say that we are secular. Like we embrace Urdu, we embrace Muslim history in India. That's kind of a mark of saying that we're cosmopolitan, we're not right-wing, we embrace this part of our culture and our history. So I think that there's actually been a resurgence in interest in Urdu among a lot of circles, and there's like study groups to study Urdu, and plays being produced in Urdu. So I think that there's a lot of factors at play as to why people would be turning to Chugtai now.
And Sadaf, are these Muslim women writers, are they being put on trials for obscenity?
Which writers? Sorry.
Following up on the previous questions about other women progressive writers at the present time.
I haven't seen, women being put on trial for obscenity, really. But I also haven't seen things being written. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think about that. Like, there have been a lot of, I'm thinking about conversations that I've heard within the Pakistani public sphere about obscenity. And I think there was recent remarks by Imran Khan, for example, saying that it's a spread of obscenity that's causing the rise in like rapes and things like that. So this concept of obscenity and how it's kind of applied in lots of different directions. I wouldn't say I can think of any writers in Pakistan that have been accused of this, but certainly actresses, activists, I can think of that have been said to be spreading obscenity. So it's definitely a charge that still has still has a significance or a resonance within Muslim communities in South Asia.
Thank you. We have another question that reads, did Chugtai shun Islam at any point in her life?
No, she didn't. Although I saw another question about her cremation that someone didn't know that. And it's very interesting because it caused quite a furor. Even within her own family, there were people who were okay with it because they said that was her last wish. And there were others in her family who were not okay with it. And there were articles written by people saying that this is unacceptable. So yeah, even like her last rites or her last wishes really caused a stir in terms of which practice belongs to who, and who gets to decide for you how you live and how you die. So no, she didn't. I think that her perspective was very much like that quote I mentioned, where she kind of held both at the same time, of being very much attached to her Muslim identity and also very much feeling like she was connected to India and the mythology and the history of India as well.
Thank you, Sadaf. Are you able to talk about Famida Riaz and Razia Saad Zahir, as they were progressive feminists? And I think there's one more, Razia Sajad Zahir, yes.
Sure. I mean, I think absolutely there are and will continue to be other progressive writers. But yeah, I don't really know what to say beyond that.
Okay, let me just see if I missed any questions. People were saying that they enjoy the presentation. She's not alone, likewise. Let's see. Have you thought about translating Chughtai work?
So actually, we're quite lucky in that a lot of her work has been translated. So there are a couple of translators, and that, as I said, I think the resurgence and interest in Chugtai really did map on to Tahir Naqvi, who's been translating her work for since the early 2000s at least. So there are a couple of people who've really done an amazing job translating. And so I think I want to kind of give more depth and color and perspective on her work beyond the translating, because as much of an interest as there is in her, there hasn't been a real academic focus on her or her work.
Thank you. One of the most common statements that we hear when we talk about inclusion of the LGBTQ communities and sexual freedom in Islam is that you're cherry picking and that the Quran doesn't condone these acts. How do we counter these arguments?
Well, it's that it doesn't have to be either or. Any tradition has various different elements to it. So it has a legalistic element, but I would say that in the modern period, Islam has kind of been boiled down to a list of do's and don'ts, something that we never would do with Christianity, for example, which also has canon law or other, legal traditions. It's really a colonial perspective where, Christian European colonialists decided that Islam and Judaism as well are just defined by their law. And that's all that matters. What can Muslims do and not do? And we would never think of defining Christians in that way and say, well, how can you be a Christian if you do X, Y, Z? That's kind of their personal issue, right? So I think that there's a place for understanding the fiqh and the legal discussions, but that really didn't dominate most people's lives. And I do find, Shahab Ahmed's argument pretty convincing that most people had their moral education through literature and the arts in Islamic societies, just as is the case in most societies. So it's worth exploring that as well and having a more balanced perspective of our history rather than one that's really, really skewed in one direction.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. I think this may be the last question. Oh, no, I jinxed it. Okay, so keep it going though. The questions are great and so are the responses. So we have a question that reads, how do we best counter, oh wow, we got like 7. Let me scroll back up. Where did my question go? Maybe it's labeled as answered. Okay, so how do we best counter these narrow-minded views of the religion? I mean, you touched on this quite a bit, but if you want.
I mean, I think, as I said, I don't fight people. I don't usually try to directly say, well, you're saying this, that's wrong. I just highlight other stories, other elements, other things, and find beauty in those things. I don't know if you all saw, but there was a really gorgeous New York Times digital article or focus on Mughal miniatures, and it was talking about creating something beautiful, and that's really what lasts. And there's so much beauty, there's so much complexity within the artistic and literary traditions of Muslim societies, and that's just what I choose to dedicate myself to reading and highlighting. And I can think, I recently saw that this book that my husband had gotten me called The Art of Party Crashing in Medieval Baghdad. And it's just so funny. It's like this humor literature from Arabic about how to crash parties. And it's so relatable. But I think that that's why I find a lot of joy and meaning in bringing attention to these primary sources. I think, so much of our understanding of Islam is mediated through centuries of the Western gaze or the colonial gaze on our societies and on our histories. And so honestly, just highlighting primary sources and literature that people can look to, or arts that people can engage with, I think is really powerful way to counter those very narrow understandings of Islam.
Thank you. So we should be winding up, but we just got such incredible questions. So I'm just gonna cherry pick some and try to get as many as we can. So one question reads, do you feel that colonialism has contributed to increasing the conservatism in Islam in the subcontinent and the repression of progressive Islam in writing?
Absolutely, absolutely, it has. And you see this in a lot of colonial writing about Islam and Muslim societies, that they're really decadent. Why were they engaging in all these arts? Why were the royalty writing poetry? They were just wasting away their lives, focused on all of these dalliances and blah, 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 blah. And that, Muslim rulers were not manly enough because they engaged in the arts or they supported the arts. And then also in terms of missionary discourses in South Asia and in the Muslim world more broadly, that said that Islam and Muslim cultures were again decadent, unreasonable. They had way too much like mysticism and stuff going on, and they were not rational enough. And so in reaction to that, a lot of these very conservative, legalistic discourses within Islam. And then I think similarly, we talked a little bit earlier about Hindu nationalism. I also think that that's a response to colonialist discourses as well, that say, well, a real religion is XYZ. And that's what Christianity is. What you guys do is way too weird. And it has too much other stuff going on, extraneous things. And, that proves that Christianity is superior. And so in response to that, people from other religious traditions were like, no. Our tradition is also extremely rational, and it doesn't need to have all this decadent stuff and arts and musics and all that stuff. We can get rid of that. And so absolutely, I lay that squarely on the feet of colonialism and colonial ways of thinking that we have kind of internalized. And as I said, that discourse that said Islam is just about the law, it was literally an argument that Christianity is about love, Islam is about the law. And, when you read a lot of this Islamic literature, you're like, no, Islam is also about love. So that's convenient, right? To say that, oh, Christianity is all about love. And these people are just really rigid and blah, 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 blah. So absolutely, I would say that I would lay that at the feet of the experience of colonialism and that sense of inferiority that colonized people are always trying to overcome.
Thank you. Nazat, do we have room for one more question, or should we wrap it up?
I think we're getting really close to the end here. And
Okay.
Sadaf, you've been fabulous and very patient with all of the questions. You noticed the interest from everyone. We got lots and lots of questions. People are wanting to see your work. So maybe you could share with us when the book is going to be published.
Absolutely.
And where we can get a copy. And also this program is being recorded, so people can have access to what you presented through the recording. And if there are any other works that you would like us to share with, with our audience, we're happy to do a follow-up e-blast with those references. So thank you very much for an amazing, amazing presentation. It was so interesting. And I have lots and lots of questions that I would love to ask you, but maybe another time. So sorry, Sabrina, I think we really should be wrapping up, but thank you, Sadaf. That was amazing. So, so enlightening. And, we promote critical thinking. So I hope, it caused a lot of critical thinking among the participants this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you all and engaging with the questions, and looking forward to continuing the conversations. And definitely will share my book when it's published. And I shared in the chat an article that I wrote that has some elements in what I discussed today.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. I do want to quickly just add that the Canadian Council of Muslim Women works very hard to push forward empowerment and equality and equity for all Muslim women in Canada. And although we are a small team of dedicated and hardworking women, together we've been able to do really essentially groundbreaking and nationwide work. And some of the things that we do, including the knowledge transfer that comes out of these seminars and projects such as the Digital Anti-Racism Project and our Legal Services Coordination Pilot Program, all of these projects and seminars are so important to Canadian Muslim women, and as well as the Layla Falman Scholarship Fund. And the work that we do is so important. So we do want people to consider donating to CCMW so that we can continue doing the work that we do. And Zainab has kindly sent a survey link for a post survey. And if everyone can fill that out so that we can only do better moving forward, that would be greatly appreciated. We do want to thank Sadaf again and to all the participants with their excellent questions. It's been great. So thank you. Okay, so before we end, I do want to make a dua. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Please God, give us the abilities and the capacities to continue to grow as a community and individually. May CCMW continue to grow with the right intentions, and may we continue to benefit and empower and work with Muslim women across Canada. Ameen.
Ameen. Thank you, Sabrine. Thanks, everyone. Salam.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Islam.